everyone, welcome back to the ScholarAI Founders Pod. Reminder to catch us on all the typical podcast locations and find us on our YouTube channel. Today we're going to be talking a little bit about the anthropomorphizing of AI, how people are kind of giving various caricatures to AI, the potential advantages and disadvantages of that, and kind of the existence of this kind of throughout history, beginning kind of maybe most famously with the movie Her. So Lakshay, I'm going to begin with you. I guess number one, starting at the highest level, what do you think about this practice? We're starting to see it kind of more and more commonly as we're talking to more and more users. What do you think the potential implications of that are? And then how do you think this may or may not be different from the anthropomorphizing of other technology, like, for example, referring to a vehicle as kind of, human-like in nature?
Yeah, it's not super surprising that folks would take a tool that has a voice and can do language and speak in style and mock a personality and give it a human quality. In talking to users, it's become pretty common that a lot of folks will refer to ChatGPT by name, like they've given ChatGPT their own name that they prefer, kind of giving them almost a nickname of sorts, giving ChatGPT kind of a pronoun that's like him or her, has felt increasingly common. I think for me, what was surprising is that we've seen companies like Replica, Character AI, they're based on the concept of having a persona, like you are selling an AI persona, but folks are imprinting a persona on something that isn't trying to project one. I think it's not super surprising that would happen. I think there's just an instinct to want to humanize technologies that seem to be, having a voice. But I think the place that ends up more concerning in my view, just when you combine that with what is the unfortunate loneliness epidemic that kind of pervades a lot of youth these days, it's kind of in my view, a bad combination of things where AI as a tool, it's not going to give you the satisfaction of an actual connection with someone. Yet the place that's seeming to have a lot of traction is in being able to mock that connection, people being willing to pay to have those sorts of connections substituted. I think on the positive side, I know a lot of users have been using something like ChatGPT, and I've used it this way all the time too. Just I have this situation, I just want general strategic advice or just to bounce my idea off of something. I think the place where it gets kind of gray is when you go insofar as wanting to use it as a therapist or wanting to use it as a trusted friend that is the only thing you can go to that sort of advice to, I think there's a lot of positive ways in which anthropomorphizing stuff is good. I think characters are a good way to bucket technology. I mean, we've seen even a Tamagotchi, that little toy you can get that puts a little pet that you have to take care of in a little box. I view that as pretty harmless, but I think in the grander scheme of things, when you combine that with the average young person's relationship with technology, the average young person's engagement with other people, and the way technology is increasingly addictive, I think it's kind of going down a bad path of I use technology. Technology is the only thing I can communicate with and trust. The characters or the personalities that I associate with this thing, I trust over human people.
I think largely that's correct. Josh, you have thoughts?
Because large language models are based on language, there's a natural kind of relationship expectation that forms where we speak to it like we speak to people, and therefore we expect a relationship like we expect with people. I think as I can completely understand why people perceive it in that way, by its nature of using language. And many AI companies are using name-based company names to create that expectation of a relationship. And so I understand why people are anthropomorphizing AI, and in some respects, I think that's helpful if you were, for example, trying to prompt for exactly the thing you need, and you treat the AI like a person, because the training data is largely based on that kind of dialogue. It makes sense that it would produce the kind of output that would be most useful in that moment for the right tool. there's an expectation that AI will continue to involve itself in our lives. If you, for example, the Optimus robot is kind of the manifestation of robotics and AI come together. There are other companies, character and Figure, for example, that are kind of bringing that anthropomorphism to life through robotics. And so I would continue to expect that, and it feels like a pretty natural extension of how we treat language and therefore how we develop that relationship.
Yeah, it's an interesting point. I think it's largely true that given that this is kind of the first thing, unless you want to talk about the Amazon Echo devices and some of the early Siri prototypes, that kind of thing, that are really using language in a way that is very similar to humans, not responding in kind of preset text like some of the earlier kind of concepts you were outlining, Lakshay. So I think it's fascinating. I think I also have some concerns, like Lakshay, you were describing potential reliance on this, and I do think this coinciding with humans' natural kind of inclination to go to things that are easier versus developing, human relationships, which are harder and take time and take more investment and get a little stickier at times, I think can be concerning. And I think people are, my hope is that people are thinking about this thing thoughtfully. But I do wonder, and Shasha, to your point, I think it's a decent strategy from a business perspective to kind of give caricatures to these different tools, especially when you're thinking about using one versus another. I think that can be quite powerful, and I think it can be quite helpful. And so I'm not exactly sure how to balance being helpful with this, again, kind of growing concern, especially when you start talking about younger children, students, that kind of thing. Lakshay, it sounds like you got thoughts.
Yeah, the unfortunate thing is that most people in general are not critical consumers of technology. Like, that's just generally the case. And I think the responsibility of like doing this the correct way mostly falls on the companies that are producing these sort of tools. But I think, at least in the modern day, the way I look at like what character AI is, what replica is, like any of these like 300 startups that are just like, you can create like a boyfriend, girlfriend out of AI, whatever. Like, my assumption is that like those are very, very like greed oriented setups where the like ethics or the impact to human experience is not really being considered. It's just like, this will make money, people pay for it. And they're just kind of going along their way, which is unfortunately unhealthy in my view. But I think there is a place for it. Like, I can totally see that in some version of the future. Like, you look at like what feels relatively healthy to me. Like, if I look at like sci-fi versions of this thing, is like Tony Stark Jarvis, right? Where like, yes, Jarvis has a personality. Yes, Jarvis has if you were to just hear him talking about things, you could probably drop like a silhouette of what he looks like as a human. But ultimately, he's not like a relationship, right? He's an assistant that is helpful in doing daily things. It's just that his voice is modulated in a way that makes him feel a little bit more easy and fun to communicate with, without necessarily being like a dependent relationship.
Yeah, I think that's right. And I think as a natural segue, when we're starting to think about these technologies and how they're going to develop, I'm curious to hear both of your thoughts as the ways you think AI is currently impacting the world. Like, Shashi, I know you alluded to robotics and things earlier, but right now it feels like the largest value proposition for these AI systems is largely in coding. I see a lot of developers really speeding up when they're writing software, that kind of thing. Even in my own work, I've been able to write software that simply would have been impossible for me to write before, just given my kind of naive skill set when it comes to software development and the assistance of these tools. So I'm curious from both you and Lakshay, again, I'll start with you. Outside of software, where do you see, either currently or in the immediate future, these AI tools having the most impact?
The easiest starting place is just writing, drafting, and doing research. All of the work where, and this is what we're seeing in the workforce, the jobs that are most immediately being augmented and at risk are the white collar jobs, the quote unquote professional learned jobs, where the person is sitting at the keyboard to do their primary work, whether that's gathering information or filtering or narrating information, drafting information, all of that. documents, presentations. Those are the areas in which AI is having an immediate impact. The mathematical work may be a bit lagging behind, as the large language models that we all have access to aren't particularly great at math. But that's being developed, and will soon be, I would imagine, compensated for through specialized models that are just amazing at solving math problems, and then deeply integrated into large language models through some kind of RAG implementation, or passing around requests based on which model best serves them. White collar work, in summary, is the most immediately impacted, and software engineers are that. It's drafting. They're drafting characters, they're drafting code, and publishing that code to be compiled or interpreted by whatever language they're using for the end user's benefit. But I would say the benefits of software engineering, it's interesting. I think some of these benefits immediately accrued to software engineers themselves to be able to do their work much faster in many cases, I think, without their employers really knowing that they could do their work much more efficiently, and therefore kind of collecting that benefit individually to themselves. And then over time, as companies have come to realize, in various grades, some companies are more tech savvy than others, and the less tech savvy companies probably still don't know that their software engineers can do their job in probably an hour or two a day. And so that benefit is still accruing to the individual engineers, whereas the more tech savvy companies are probably accruing some portion of that benefit to themselves, but there's still probably, I would imagine, a significant part of that benefit still accruing to the individual engineers.
Yeah, I think a good portion is that, like, a good amount of tasks like AI is helpful with. The difference is that with GPT-2, like, I guess just going back a couple years, when GPT-2 came out, like, people started using it for everything and everything. Like, people tried it. But with software, the difference is that, like, whereas one person who's like working on PowerPoint or working on like writing a draft, seeing a flaw in what the GPT generation does is usually a reason to be like, oh, this is still too early in the oven, I'm going to put it aside. Whereas, like, when you're a software engineer, like, you're interacting with the technology already, the base instinct is, okay, this GPT-2 thing, it was pretty good. I mean, I could do a good amount of it. It's not enough. Let me see if I can just like push it a little bit over the edge with my own modification to do the job I needed to. And that kind of just drives its own momentum around making the product better and better for software development, right? I mean, I'm sure that's like part of the origin story of how like Cursor came about, where GitHub Copilot was just like a little bit too frustrating. So Cursor evolved, right? There's just a number of steps that kind of went backwards from that. I think outside of software, the reason in my impression that hasn't connected with users is simply just because of that pick a flaw issue, where there's just like too many obvious glaring problems that makes it feel like this stuff is too early, and most users aren't aware of alternatives, right? They aren't aware that like the typical consumer is not a technologist, so they're not like actively seeking out other applications to solve their problem. Usually it's, my friend has this way of solving their problem, they told me about it, so I went at and checked out that one thing. Otherwise, there's no awareness, right? But the typical person doesn't know what Anthropic is. The typical person doesn't know what Google Gemini is, right? All they know is ChatGPT. And when you're confronted with what this like search bar can do, you probably say, hello, how are you? Is the best of your prompts to begin with. And you see it and there's like, what was the point of this? This wasn't useful to me, right? So I do think a lot of it has to do with like, we're just like super, super early in that there are definitely better answers to a lot of people's problems. Like white collar work, I think, is waiting to be impacted, but it just seems to be packaged in a way that the value delivery is really, really obvious. Whereas everyone's still kind of on chatbots as it currently stands. And those only go so far for who the typical user is.
Yeah, I think that's well said. I think the only additional thought I have mostly is that I agree drafting and reviewing is the next place. I think the difference primarily in a lot of white collar work outside of coding is that there is no immediate feedback loop to know if the AI is getting it right or wrong, and to be able to very quickly improve. And what I mean by that is, as you're writing software, it becomes very obvious when you've gotten it right. The thing is working like you want it to. It's not throwing any errors. etc. When you're writing a draft of anything or you're making a PowerPoint, there is this level of subjectivity in it, and you simply don't know when the AI is getting it correct. Yes, we can observe obvious errors, meaning the AI is effectively hallucinating or making up things, stating things that are untrue. But of this infinite problem space that we're trying to solve in writing a draft, especially in a draft with some level of objectivity, so not thinking about poems or short stories, but rather thinking about a work-related memo in which you might be writing a report based on earnings or based on projections or something like this, that becomes far more subjective, and I think very difficult to put AI in a position to where it can iteratively improve over time. And so I think that's why we're seeing the lag compared to software, where again, AI creates some code, it throws an error. You usually get very descript error logging for said code. So you can go back to the AI and say, no, this is where you made a mistake. We need to improve these things. And that feedback loop becomes very tight. And as a result, I think we've seen some kind of rapid acceleration there. I am curious to see, where we think that will go next. But the one thing I will say in addition to that, though, in which I do think it's already beginning to impact work outside of coding, is this element of going from 0 to 1. So I know in speaking to a lot of my peers, sometimes they get a little bit of writer's block or kind of that activation energy of going from blank page to some form of template at which they can kind of then work from. I see AI as being incredibly accelerating in that phase. So oftentimes, even myself, if I don't really know where to start with a document, I'll just go to something like Claude or ChatGPT, ask it for a template. It will craft that template for me, and then I can go into polish and finish off details after it's kind of given me the skeleton from which to work, which again, I feel is greatly accelerating, even though it's probably 50% or 60% of the solution. Whereas with coding, we're getting closer to 90 or 95%.
Yeah, I use ChatGPT and otherwise for the same sort of problem. Just like, I don't know where to start. Here's the general theme of the thing I'm trying to create. Like, can you give me the starting blocks for it? And if anything, it not working the way I want it to, like it having the wrong style or having an insufficient description of the thing I'm hoping for, just elucidates what's important to me and tells me kind of how I need to revise and go forward with the template. I also will say, we haven't talked about it too much just because we live in the domain of language. Our product lives in the domain of written text. But Photoshop and AI integration to editing tools has been really, really potent. And that one's super subtle in that you will not see that a product has been using AI for editing or image creation. But very clearly has had an impact. The AI integration to Photoshop has been memed. It's been turned into TikToks. It's gone viral quite a good amount. It's very effective. I know, I say this at any level of expertise. I have learned Photoshop before, and now that skill is basically useless because all I'd use it for was editing my friends' faces onto movie posters for their birthdays. And that is trivial. My skill set's done. It's over. I can just drag stuff over, say, put this face on this face, and it's done. There are a lot of cases where we've seen movie posters and trailers. Folks are becoming more alert to AI generated content and actually calling out the artist whenever, because there's all sorts of reasons that a movie poster using stable diffusion type of AI generation looks really, really bad. And that's still happening. I think for image generation, AI feels like it's all the way there. It just feels like people are still kind of blundering with it in some of the creative image use cases that makes it feel lower trust. And that way, I think less invisibly pervasive than we would think it should be. But I think generally for the most part for photo editing and photo generation, or even just I know there are a bunch of startups who do AI models for clothes. So you can if you have a brand and you're creating clothing, it will put the clothes onto those models for you, so you don't have to pay for an actual model's fee. I think all that sort of stuff is very invisibly happening and doing quite well. It's just not understood or spoken about very often.
One of the things that I'm really excited for, I don't know how far we are away from it, but the last comment you said made me think of this, is photogrammetry. You guys familiar with this concept? It's essentially the idea of stitching a sequence of 2D images together to create a 3D model. And so, you can think about taking, usually it's done in sequence with, hundreds of images so that you can actually reconstruct some sort of 3D rendering of usually an object. Think about like a vase or a chair for your living room, those kind of things. And so basically these images become represented in 3D space such that you can actually begin to visualize them in a space. Like Amazon has a lot of this technology. There are several companies that are working on this. But I'm fascinated to see if we can go from the need to have hundreds or even thousands of high quality images to create a great 3D rendering to going to a few, right? You could imagine a reality in which maybe only 5 to 10 is needed in order to actually get to some sort of three-dimensional rendering of a physical item. And that could be very powerful for kind of, again, trying to render, imagine you're thinking about adding a new chair to your living room and you want to know if it fits and how much space you'd have in your living room after the new chair was put in there. I'm very excited for that. And then as a secondary layer to this, and I think that we're several years from this, but the other thing that is fascinating to me is as these non-language models, but as the diffusion models that we're kind of speaking about now become better and better, citing Sora as maybe the state-of-the-art model from OpenAI. The thing that is fascinating to me is these models are beginning to develop a sort of physics engine without those physics engines being explicitly programmed. I'm very interested to see if the evolution of that can lead us to 3D renderings with physical properties. So things beyond just the visuals, but actual weight, actual center of mass, actual things that can begin to enhance physics simulations, engineering simulations in a way that you can go from prototype to, or really idea to developed prototype in a much faster way. Like right now, currently, state of the art for this is some version of 3D printing. So you mock this thing up in some sort of software, some sort of AutoCAD or Fusion 360 or something similar to this. You then end up 3D printing the prototype such that you can begin to visualize its physical properties, how big it might be, does component 1 interact well with component 2, etc. But being able to do that computationally before having to, 3D printing is fairly cheap. It's not super accurate. It doesn't really have the right center of mass because you're not printing with the right material properties. There are lots of software that has tried to do this before, but is very, very difficult. And then even one step beyond that, a lot of like fluid simulations and things that are currently unanswerable. If all of a sudden we get better at inexplicitly designing physics engines, I think the kind of capabilities of that are both fascinating and impressive.
Yeah, I think that sort of thing, it happens. I think obviously the problem we've seen with LLMs and just like, I guess we talk about AI generically, so I don't know if you meant to say like LLM or like a large model based tooling, because fluid simulations and that sort of stuff lives in a different domain of AI currently, right? But what you're kind of talking about is these diffusion models that like can simulate reality to some extent on the prompt. I think at best that ends up being synthetic data for what is a more traditional AI system. Just, it's hard for me to believe that like the faults of LLMs that exist right now, again, what is them kind of converging on average for everything, same with photos, same with videos, is sufficient for describing reality in a way that is useful for a machine to be able to interact with, right? Like a really popular domain of like fluid simulations, like you see a lot of people will pour honey, right? Like their fluid simulation energy, like their liquid simulation engine will be pouring honey, show me how it kind of like aggregates on top of this cube, right? That to me doesn't feel like something that gets solved or like is sufficiently captured by what is a diffusion model. It just feels too prone to faulty assumptions about like how honey coalesces, like what is the temperature of the honey, and then you end up in this sort of mess that is less controlled. At best, it's like if you go from video to physics or something, there might be something there about a specific model that does that sort of thing. But for right now, it feels that with how diffusion models and LMs are doing in general, it doesn't feel to me like you can sufficiently hop to physics without a secondary model in the loop.
Yeah, it's two things. Point of correction. I don't know if I said large language models or not, but you're correct. I meant diffusion models, like Sora. So I am when I'm thinking about physics engines, I'm certainly thinking about diffusion, not large language models. Yeah, apologies if I got that confused earlier. But the other point that you're making, I think, is the right one. I don't think that we're going to get explicitly to these kind of physics engines with just diffusion. I think it's going to take other things. I think my hope is that that's the inspiration for it, where it was otherwise not possible. I think that my hope is, I guess, said a different way, is the diffusion models currently, the idea that we can take an idea, make it into a movie with some level of integrated physics is step one to actually making physical products, or physical prototypes with integrated levels of physics. And I agree. It's fluid dynamics is largely an intractable problem. And that's what I mean. Like that doesn't really have a solve. And people have been working on this for, decades, I'm saying the entire history of basically modern science, and no one has solved it yet. And I guess again, going back to thinking about this, like we've seen advancements in the ability to model antibodies and biomolecules as an example. My hope is that with these new compute demands that AI is going to bring, that increased compute bleeds over into these more hard sciences, so that people are actually advancing knowledge. So anyway, I think it's fascinating, but I think ultimately you're right. I think we're a long way away from the ability to be able to go from I have an idea to print me out the material composition of said prototype. Great. That's an excellent transition from there. I'm also given that we're talking about a lot of these models and that kind of thing, I think that energy remains top of mind anytime we're talking about AI. It's consumption for energy, it's demand on energy. We're seeing several of the largest companies in the world turning their next investment strategy towards various versions of nuclear. So, Shashi, why don't we start with you? What are your thoughts overall on the energy demands of AI, how we've seen some of these companies pivoting into this space, and then speculate a little bit, if you'd like, about what you think is coming down the pipe?
The conversation I hear at conferences is what percentage of the Earth do we imagine covered in data centers? It's not perceiving data center growth to stop anytime soon. So what's paid so far in the AI space? NVIDIA, the chips themselves driving most of this AI training and inference. It's the data centers, the server farms, the footprint of data centers, and all of the providers for cooling, for power, for components that go into data centers. That has all paid. It's cloud hosting next, and we're in the middle of earnings season now, so we're seeing the major cloud providers posting earnings and reporting growth. And the summary of this is that the whole market is growing. It's growing really fast, and there's no end in sight. And the criticisms that are being levied, if any, are that these data centers aren't growing fast enough to meet demand. So there's more demand for these data centers than supply, and all of the cloud hosting providers are basically fully occupied. So any data center they can put up is getting fully utilized. So what we're seeing so far now, the stack move up from the chip to the server farm and server components to the data center, and all the power and cooling and everything that goes into that data center. You asked specifically about the power. My expectation is that power needs will continue to accelerate in line with the data center demand, and that's just not going to stop anytime soon.
Yeah, Akshay, thoughts there?
Yeah, there's this is actually very, very topical. Google, I think it was like 2 weeks ago, announced that they were going into their first commercial partnership to use small modular nuclear reactors. And so I was just reading the details as Shasha was talking. That agreement was based on a non-powered demonstration reactor. So it's still super, super early, but there are absolutely I think energy is proving to be a precursor that is pretty severe on data centers. I think we obviously don't have enough data centers to serve the amount of demand there is, but the precursor statement that's going to come up that hasn't come up super intensely yet is, where is the power coming from? And it seems like Google is beginning to engage in the document where they announced this partnership. They talk very explicitly about the reason being to power AI systems. I think it's kind of inevitable that this will lead to turning to more energy sources. I think it's also kind of nicely timed in that the conversation around energy has become one that is of cleanliness. So people are looking at like geothermal, people are looking at nuclear. It feels kind of inevitable that's going that way. I think it's just super early to say like how effective it will be, given that like, for example, these small modular reactors that Google's investing in haven't been demoed in like a powered circumstance yet. So it'll just be a ongoing challenge, I think, but I think one that is very natural to end up solving. It doesn't feel to me like there will be an obstacle. I think what actually ends up being the bottleneck is the data center realistically, just because I don't think we've hit the limit of power usage. What we're hitting the limit of is server availability to solve these problems. I guess like server efficiency to solve these problems, especially as these models, the way to make them more and more useful is to make them bigger, better, react more quickly to things for the consumer, right? And that consumer is granting them the data. Without that data, you can't make the models better. So the game is a little bit less about energy right now, it feels like, and more just data center. How many users can I serve? How do we get the most users? And how those users give us data that we can then train on.
I've heard some people debate which power generation source will be in vogue, whether that's wind or solar or hydro or coal or nuclear. And my perception is that in the short term, unknown, there will be variance, but in the medium to long term, it will be all of the above. There's just not a scenario in which we can pick favorites among that mix. We're going to need all of them. They've all got trade-offs, and our demand is going to be greater than we can supply with any preferred or favorite set of sources of energy. We're just going to need all of them running full steam.
Yeah, I do think nuclear in general has been a little bit stalled, like regulatory wise. Like I think obviously there's been a number of historical events that have driven negative perception about nuclear, but I think it is unfortunate that nuclear is not moving as fast as it could be, or I guess at least insofar as seeing like really big approvals or big innovation that ends up in like new plants being made is a pretty slow process. I think in general, I agree though that like geothermal, like putting like the equivalent of windmills in the ocean, like dams, etc., like you're going to need to collect it from wherever you can. I think the good thing that's happening is that everyone's taking a pretty clean orientation towards stuff in general, and that like we're not, at least the dialogue of like what does energy look like going forward is not one where we are looking at like burning a resource we can't get back effectively. So I think in the short term, I mean, we're seeing a lot, to come back to the political conversation, we're seeing a lot of stuff that's like return to like unclean sources. And I think that's serving a short-term need, but I'm hopeful in the longer term, we manage to remove that a little bit and like generally change the meter as to how much of it can be cleanly supplied versus coming from fossil fuels and otherwise.
Actually, I'm just curious, how do you feel about, for example, we have a lot of Teslas on the road now, and Rivians as well, but really in the main, the conversation about EVs is Tesla. Many of them are getting charged with coal-powered electricity production. Sort of feels like it's defeating the purpose. What's your take on that?
I agree. I mean, I think like it is unfortunate that it's happening. I'm not surprised that like that's kind of the flow of things, and that like at the bare minimum, the consumer is deriving the benefit. That is, I'm using an electric car, so at least on like the governmental level, like I'm being incentivized to be using a car that is generally over long-term day-to-day more sustainable than the alternative, right? I'm not asking for gas every couple of weeks to keep my transport alive. I am simply using electrical power as opposed to consuming gas. I think going back to like the question of these cars are being produced with coal-based power, or like my energy still coming from an unclean grid, I think it's inevitable. I think it's unfortunate that like the dialogue is kind of hand slappy still when the intent of the company is like be progressing towards clean. But I'm not surprised that is happening. Ultimately, like this is the flow of things. I think as energy becomes more cleanly available generally, the nice thing about the hand slap is that the hand slap landing on the corporation incentivizes them to figure out cleaner energy at the base, right? Like it means that innovation will happen that's more larger scale, not putting onus on the consumer's purchasing patterns to lead to cleaner behavior, which is something that we've seen kind of a lot of in some corporation cases where we're clean because we force our users to make cleaner decisions rather than just we have clean practices at the base level.
Yeah, I think the question you asked is a great one, Shashi. And my only comment, in addition to luxury, is that you have to start somewhere. And starting there is a good path. We simply can't power all the electric vehicles on the road with the kind of sustainable wind, electric, et cetera, that we have. Hopefully the migration is to that, but it does feel a little bit like chicken and egg in the sense that if you have gas powered cars, there's no need for increased electricity outside of the realm of AI, like we've been discussing, obviously. But as electric vehicles proliferate, at least it's a step in the right direction. The other thing I want to touch on with respect to energy is I'm seeing some progress coming out of worlds that were kind of nodded to beginning about a decade ago, at least as my memory serves, is that the idea of using, rather than relying on the 2-bit information that comes out of digital electronics now, which is ones and zeros, using various forms of biology, namely DNA, to improve the storage capacity of compute. And recently, we actually saw a company that was trying to commercialize this technology. And so kind of going at this energy problem from the opposite way, rather than trying to create more energy, which is obviously being done at the largest scales, they were trying to use energy more efficiently by building better components, effectively better electronic components. And again, with the central idea here being that because current electronics rely on 2-bit, basically they can process information in the form of zeros and ones. DNA, as an example, has 4 different base pairs. And so you are comparing 4 versus 2, which leads to exponential increases in kind of your storage capability, at least. So Fletcher, you're nodding. I'm curious if you have thoughts and any reactions to kind of that, even as the ideas are in their complete nascency.
Yeah, for the record, I completely love that stuff. Like, I think that's super, super cool that is happening. And I've forgotten about it. Like, I heard about it a couple times, like a couple years ago. I don't know when it came up from some startup or something trying to make a CPU that was like DNA based storage. I don't know, without having done any research myself, I say this just in like the most skeptical way possible, is that like so much of biology is so vulnerable to temperature. It's so vulnerable to environment, right? All it takes is like a minor temperature or like a acidity change for a protein to completely fall apart, right? All of these molecules, their shape changes, their like behavior changes as you modulate temperature. I think in some cases that can be a benefit, right? More modularity that you can control means more information that you can store in one I guess molecule is still correct. I think that being said, it feels like it'll take a long time for it to get there. I know I was just talking to a friend. He's doing a NLP like PhD, like he's living at like the architecture level of these LM models. He's exploring right now, like he's in the stage of like wanting to do his dissertation. He was just exploring a model that's doing ternary storage. So nothing at the level of the compute itself, nothing at the level of the chip, but just saying like if an LM is trying to generate with -1, 0, and 1, rather than just 0 and 1, how much of a speed improvement can you see? And it's gnarly in theory, right? As a paper from Microsoft that he was reading. In the biology case, I think that one ends up a lot more interesting if we can get it right, just because pure curing molecules is something that we can like do very provably. And the processes that help us make chips and wafers is like super, super intense. I think the question that emerges like, is that process going to be good enough to actually help us replace or even complement existing chip designs, existing manufacturers in 10, 20, 50 years? It feels like something that could be very, very far away, even if in theory it's a good idea. It might never, it's the sort of thing that like, it will rarely leave the research lab just because it's so hard to kind of get right or so hard to functionalize without some specific type of funding and a very, very specific value add saying we can make compute like 70% more energy efficient, or we can make compute 80% faster. Until we kind of get to that point, it's just not the sort of thing that feels like we'll get commercialized or commercialization ready funding.
Yeah, I had the same concerns. I mean, biology is in ways that are different to the electronics we have today. They are subject to increased degradation, typically, even at room temperatures and that kind of thing. They typically degrade faster. The evidence that these people were showing was counter to that. In fact, the DNA they were stating is as stable in many cases, and sometimes even more stable, which I'll hold skepticism to see if that actually is true or not. But in any event, I had the exact same thought is stability becomes the primary concern, but it does feel, at least in theory, that those problems are on their way to being solved. So time will tell. But I think it's fascinating. And I think with that, we are coming up on time here. So we're going to call it for today's episode of the ScholarAI Founders Pod. Thanks everybody for joining us. As always, make sure to check back next week on all the typical podcast locations and find us on our YouTube channel. See you all next time.